Welcome to the show, everyone. It's Front and First. I'm Sam Selkoff, and today I'm super excited to be joined by my buddy Tom Occhino. We got a special guest. Tom basically was around, helped create React and React Native, led the React team at Facebook for a long time, and starting back in 2009, and recently, a couple of years ago, left, and now is working at Vercel. But he has been one of the godfathers of React, and I'm super excited to have him here today. So welcome to the show, Tom.
Sam, thank you so much. It's good to be on the show. I'm a fan of the podcast. Yeah, let's get into it. Where do you want to start, man?
Man, we got a lot to talk about. So we met this year actually at React Conf in Vegas, and
Finally.
finally, I know it had been years of just kind of following each other around on the internet. But listeners of the show know I got into React a little bit after like that first wave, I would say that really early wave. Um, but I've just been loving it and always watched you and the team and the work that you guys had done, the research that led to React, the problems it solved, and just watched honestly with just like a fascination, a curiosity, because I was like the way you described kind of like the problem driven approach, like the problem that led to the solution. And I think
Right.
with any open source tool, with any technology we use as web developers, it's really good to understand the problem that led to something so that you can know if you have that problem, and therefore if the tool is kind of applicable to your problem space, your situation.
Yeah.
So I've always appreciated that about your talks. I'll definitely put some links up to some key talks of yours in the show notes for folks maybe who haven't followed that, or don't have as many grays in their beards as we do. But recently you had your first kind of public talk in a while, and you were talking about what you've been thinking about, working about since leaving Facebook. So I'm going to definitely link to that one. I think folks should listen to that to get caught up. But I figured we would start today's conversation kind of picking up from that, and that was I think that was a couple years ago, right, or 1 or 2 years ago.
Yeah, definitely at least, I think it was 2 years ago. And I had already been gone from Facebook I left Facebook in June of 2021.
Mhm.
But yeah, the other one, I guess, like the backstory you can watch is the React documentary to learn a little bit about where React came from. And that sort of like problem forward, super humble, like, hey, we had this problem. Here's how we solved it. I don't know. What do you think? So we talk a little bit about that in the documentary, and then also that Ben Dunphy hosted an event, which was really cool in SF.
Awesome. That's perfect. So I'll link to those too. So let's pick up kind of at where you were talking about in that event with Ben. And my kind of like quick summary of it is, you talked about where React came from and React Native, which you were part of, um, and how that was solving this problem that was kind of plaguing front end JavaScript devs at the time, which was this imperative updating of the DOM, and how it was like a lot of bookkeeping. People had to know whether you had just called slide down on jQuery, if you were going to slide it up again, where do you keep that? It's like the truth is in the DOM. And React
Yeah,
really turned the whole world upside down and said, let's go to a declarative model. And as you point out in this event, that's basically has been adopted, that mindset, um, that framework of thinking about this problem by all of the modern front end frameworks, which is like a huge win, for Jordan and for you and for the
that's
whole
right.
team. That's like the biggest win of the technology, I think. Um,
Yeah, the early days, I think the biggest thing we saw was engineers were just moving slower, and everybody was scared to make changes to things. The code base got bigger. It's like, oh, I don't want to touch that. Like, I don't know what's going on here. So there was a few things that we thought were good about React early on, and then as we started to use it, we discovered a set of different things that were good about it. And we found that it ended up helping us scale not just our code base, and you can make like changes more easily. They're more predictable. It's the early days of React.
mhm.
Um, but also, as we scaled our teams, they could work kind of independently. And I think it was because of the component as the abstraction boundary. It's like, okay, I'm just working in my component. There's a contract between this and the rest of the system. And I mostly don't have to worry about that. So I can be productive right here. So yeah, we started out thinking it was going to be good because of this. Wow, I no longer need to deal with these manual imperative mutations of my views, and things are always out of sync. And but then it ended up being this like way to help us sort of scale to very large code bases and very large teams. So Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that part of it, because I remember in one of Jordan Walk's talks about why he thought React became so successful is because it's basically like functional programming disguised in a form that's,
Yeah, that's right.
um, suitable or digestible for, your kind of average web developer. And I thought that was a
Yeah.
very interesting talk. And one of the things he talks about in that is how functional programming kind of pushes side effects to the edges, which has this
Yeah.
effect of what you're talking about, which is just by design, almost it falls out of the design of this setup. You're going to have parts of your app that are isolated. And so you have a massive company, massive code base like a Facebook, and you realize like you're not going to just keep an abstraction like and know how every button is used on every property. It's just not going to happen. So
Exactly.
you want something that um, plays to the unique challenges that let someone come and try new things, new libraries over here without touching it over there. And I think that's going to lead into
That's
our
right.
conversation about GraphQL and server components. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, I think this idea that you can kind of push the complexity and the side effects out to the place where the person who has the most context is sort of operating, rather than centralizing all of that and hoping that somebody can keep all of that in your state, right? We used to have, it was like an MVC sort of architecture, but our models and our controllers were so big and so fat that like only the like tech lead of the team that had
Yeah.
been there for 4 years kind of understood all the properties, and like you could never remove one, right? Because you're like, well, I don't know, some experiment might be using it somewhere. So React had this effect of sort of like pushing the complexity to the leaf nodes where somebody who knows that space is iterating, and then also making it kind of like hot swappable in a way. Like, okay, I know what my contract is with my props, I have my own state, let me just kind of explore this space without necessarily making changes to the massive controller in the middle, if you will.
Yep. It's funny because I've worked and consulted on very large Ember apps, and it's a similar thing. There was an update at one point, both to Ember and I believe to React Router, that had to do with apps whose route manifest was so large that just sending the global list of routes down to the client was like a bottleneck, in
That's
terms of
right.
like building even like the client
Yeah.
experience. So this kind of gets this idea that like it's nice when you come from a conventional framework like a Rails to just kind of say, I know where everything is and like we have our abstraction set up. But it's also true that sometimes, like you said, you need to be able to have experiments. And even those frameworks today have ways of doing that. But it was really a new way to think about it. And
It's new.
it's
Yeah.
like, let's actually just embrace the fact that we're not going to be able to like design this perfectly and keep extending it. We need to have people have their own bomb shelters. That's like kind of what a component is.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah.
so okay, so that whole like the declarative boundary, not having to think globally was like, I think a huge part of it. That's kind of your take as well. That's what you're saying was the actuality of the experience at Facebook. And
Yeah.
then what happened next was basically, I mean, GraphQL came out, which was another just huge innovation. And again, flipped in the same way that the conversation we just had, how it flips this idea of like top down into bottom up. Now, instead of having to have a single model layer that covers and spans the entire application, every possible domain, having a single query interface that can support any possible, you have to know what the queries are when you're kind of setting up the models and the relationships. Um, and you have to know maybe how this data was loaded, if it was partially loaded, if you're coming from here and going into this route. Now you kind of turn that around with GraphQL and say, well, hey, we have these components, they're the bomb shelters, but they're going to our data layer, and that's still where we have this like centralized place that's kind of leaking into the bomb shelter. So they can't actually go to
That's
town
right.
and make a mess. What if we could
That's
just
right.
have them do that?
Yeah. The sort of like steps to GraphQL were really interesting. Like imagine the most basic app you've ever seen in like early days. Facebook was kind of this where you would just like create an endpoint for any data that you needed, right? And so you have this bespoke endpoint. It's like, I'm going to post a status and it goes to a specific endpoint for like status, post, receiver, whatever, that one thing. And it does one thing really well. Or I want to get the friends list. And a simple client, a simple endpoint, And this is kind of crazy. Like it scales, like it just kind of grew sort of out of control here. So what you ended up doing was you started creating some like what I would call super endpoints. And the super endpoint is like, well, anytime I need to fetch a friends list data, here's my contract. I'll tell you the format that I need to receive it in, HTML because it's going to the website, or mobile HTML because it's going to the mobile website, and that has to be a thinner, payload and less JavaScript, et cetera. Or I need JSON because it's going to the API. So I have this friends list endpoint. And then like I'll pass a bunch of parameters to like customize this one specific endpoint. So every one of these endpoints would turn into these like massive super endpoints. And then I need like N of those, right? Because I don't just need to fetch friends list, I need to fetch friends. And then you have this problem where like, okay, I have to fetch the friends list from the friend list endpoint. And that gives me the list of IDs based on the query parameters and the format that I asked for. But then I also need to use that data and fetch other data that's dependent on that data. So then you'd create these like sort of relational endpoints that was like, okay, I need the friends associated with a friends list. And you can kind of see where this is going. It's like as you create infinitely more views, you need different configurations of the data. And because we had multiple different targets, eventually we had an iOS app, an Android app, a desktop website, a mobile website, and these like esoteric, weird sort of interfaces you'd never seen before, like Facebook's running on a refrigerator somewhere. I don't know. But they all need sort of something slightly different. And so what we ended up doing was sort of exposing the data, the relational data layer that we had, that we've built as this thing called Ent. And we ended up exposing it via this like introspective type system GraphQL, what would eventually become GraphQL. It started out as Supergraph, and then it became GraphQL.
Wasn't there a
And
name for it?
now
Wasn't it like SQL something? Wasn't there another name where it was like?
we wanted to call it GQL, but this was taken by something that Google released, which is like a Google platform API for something.
Gotcha.
And then they extended it to GraphQL, but that was after the initial pull request, or we call them diffs. The initial change was Supergraph RFC.
Nice.
And it was like, what if you could do this? I mean, I remember where this came from. So Nick Schrock and the team behind it, we used to like hack in the office together on whiteboards and stuff. And there was a couple of realizations where convention over configuration, right? Like this is a common practice. And like, what if instead of you having to configure all of the names of all of these methods, the methods were just generated for you? And because we code gen all of the methods that would do all of the data fetching for you in a privacy aware fashion, now we can create this sort of like very declarative type system that sits over the top of it. And now we can create this query language that just abstracts away all of this stuff. So it ended up being like the perfect solution for Facebook, where we have multiple clients, infinite surface area UI, many engineering teams that don't talk to each other and need a centralized contract, but in that sort of like distributed, scalable way. And GraphQL ended up being kind of the thing. We sort of standardized on that at Facebook. I think there's a question about like, does everyone need something like this? It seems like a heavy abstraction that was built on years and years and years of abstraction on top of abstraction. I mean, the whole thing goes back to like the way that we do data fetching from our data centers. We had this abstraction called cache get data, and then cache get SCB, and then we had this sort of ent layer thing, and I'm probably skipping abstractions in there. And all of this stuff built on top of each other, and that created sort of GraphQL, which was elegant and beautiful. But it was built on top of all of this other stuff that already existed, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I think it's such a cool story, man. I could hear you talk about those stories forever. I mean, they say, necessity is the mother of innovation. And man, there was a lot of innovation happening in that room at those couple years. It was pretty amazing when you really think about it. But like I said at the beginning, I think it's great to understand the problems that led to it.
Right.
But in the same way that maybe a startup just starting out doesn't have a problem of shipping too much JavaScript, and so they wouldn't need to develop or use something like a React that maybe was developed to help reduce the amount of JavaScript. Maybe that was a big part of it. It's still the case that today, right, it's better than what a startup founder would have used 10 or 20 years ago. So even though it came up to solve problem X, something about the ethos, the philosophy, the incredible talent and ingenuity of the software engineering behind these libraries made it useful for that other situation as well. And I think for the same reason, I'm finding it very interesting thinking about the fact that even though GraphQL came up in this environment that you're describing, where you have cache get and obviously like a crazy complex product like Facebook, somehow, because of the constraints of the organization of having to give different departments their own bomb shelters, even if you don't have that complexity in your own data layer, GraphQL did enable you to have that extra level of bomb shelter in your components. And so someone like me starting a company, a new website, I can see the benefits of that, where I get to co-locate the thing that I love about React that maybe I didn't even realize about it, that I am getting to just draw little boxes. I come back 6 months later and I can just start a new page and I can use a new library and I can use Radix instead of Aria. Well, now I can
That's
just
right.
query something without having to understand the data model there. So I love that it's like somehow it came about as a result of these specific challenges you all had, but very much feels in line with the ethos of React, the core beliefs in this, again, the functional programming, the no, like just how can we draw a line around here, make it fun, make it feel like Legos. So
That's right. Yeah, it feels like we discovered something more than, we sort of invented
yes,
something. And I think
yes.
the interesting bit about that sort of like, we're talking about these like pathological endpoints that just get crazy with scale. Scale kind of ruins everything. And how that's not a problem that sort of everybody has. Well, the problem that everybody does have is like I have the page that I'm on and I need to get data for this page. And then I have that page over there and I need to get data for that page. And so great, you can make sort of two endpoints or two functions or whatever to load data on those two pages. But we naturally want to compose things. And so what ends up happening is you're like, well, I have this component, my like nav bar or my like whatever, on these two pages. And so like, what do? We create a function, we create an abstraction, we create a component. And now what I want to do is I want to say like, I need all of the data for this component anytime this component shows up, whether it's on that page or that page. And GraphQL ended up being really uniquely suited to solve this problem. Although there's other ways to solve it. We just, you use the tool you got. We had a hammer, everything looked like a nail. And the GraphQL being so uniquely positioned to solve this for us, the reason was because we could basically co-locate the user interface and the data it needed with a declarative query. Started out as .graphql files that had the same name as the UI where they were used. But eventually, with Relay, we sort of embedded the query inside of a template, literal, inside of the React component. And again, just like co-locating your HTML and your JavaScript, people thought we were crazy. But this was beautiful now because anytime I needed to put a profile picture on the page, I could just use the profile picture component, pass it an ID as prop, and let it fetch all its data. My favorite example actually was way more sophisticated. It was this thing we had called a type ahead, so autocomplete input. You could pass this thing a connection, like a configuration. Basically, you say like, I want all of user one's friends. And when you say this is the type and this is the ID, it would do all this. I can't even describe to you how sophisticated the data fetching was for that one little component. It would bootstrap download the most common results, and then it would configure a custom queryable endpoint where it would stream in more results. And all I did as a front end engineer or as somebody who's building a product was I just used the component and I just gave it the props. It was great. So we can get into the problems that this creates if you want. It solves a bunch of problems that they feel universal. These are no longer problems of history or scale. Now we're talking about problems that anybody who tries to use this, because this is a relevant setup for me. I have this component I want to exist on multiple pages. We could talk about the problems that creates if you want.
Right, right. No, that's so cool. And yeah, anyone who's worked on a type ahead search knows
Yeah.
if they could just drop in a component and have it take care of all the concerns of that, that would be amazing. And it's usually never the case, right? Usually you have to go and wire up a new API endpoint. You have to implement get server side props, or you have to write a new query and you have to deal with the caching and all of this stuff. I kind of talked about this in my next conf talk, but it feels like today, every time we leave the happy parts of our React apps that are the UI stuff that we've been working on basically for 10 years now, and the community has done a very good job of componentizing. Um, it feels less fun because it doesn't feel like Legos anymore, because I can't just use Framer Motion and animate a modal from Radix, because I have to, okay, well, I'm in Next, I have to do get server-side props, or I'm in a front-end app, a React router app, and I have to make an API endpoint. So, I mean, really with the story we've said so far, you could really tell a history of React from the perspective of how can we localize the behavior more and more and more? And,
Sure.
you know, when you start with original React and your talk and Pete Hunt's talk, rethinking best practices, and getting across this idea that we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they're in separate files, but the separation of technologies, that the separation of concerns is a side effect of the separation of technologies. And actually what we want is a locality of behavior. And so we can do that with React, unifying those things. And then now, you know, what you just said, well, let's just squint at an autocomplete, a fully functional autocomplete that is serving a user goal in the UI. It is actually helping a user achieve something. Well, it has HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which is inside this slice of a React component. But now we've left the vertical and we have to go horizontal again. Do we need to create a new model, a new controller? Do we need to create a new endpoint or a function? And now we figure out how to bring that in and make it even more local. So it's almost like that's the history of the whole thing, you know?
Exactly right. We've been working on the same problem of sort of co-locating all of the concerns of a specific piece of UI for forever. And this was kind of not quite the final frontier, but like getting data to be co-located with your presentation and your behavior was like such a big unlock for us, because it meant that I could build a component and I could use it here and I could use it there, and I could build the, you know, the canonical, you know, design system UI component, but with knowledge of my backend and with the data, and it's so easy to use, and it was awesome. We were chasing this for forever. But the obvious problem is you embed a bunch of these things on a page and they all have to do their own data fetching, and now you get waterfalls and you get bad performance and you get inefficiency. And so, you know, we had to devise a number of solutions to solve that next problem. So it's like in life, there's no such thing as solutions. We only have the ability to trade off one set of problems for a different and hopefully better set of problems.
Well
So every
said.
time we crank the wheel one more time.
As an economist, as someone who was in grad school for econ, and you know, my favorite economist, Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman, both, you know, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. That is a great thing to hear. So I think it's something we need to keep in mind more as well. But sorry, continue. I just had to call
Thank
that
you.
out.
No, that's great. I appreciate the quote attribution there, because you know, we've applied this in a bunch of contexts, but effectively all we do is we solve the next problem that we see in front of us. We think about it a lot and we solve it, and then we wait to see what next problem emerges. And that's what happened when we had our sort of GraphQL co-located with our components. The first version of the framework that we built for this, before we were calling it Relay even, I'll have to think back to what we initially were calling it. But the fundamental problem was we would load up this page and then we would generate these queries and then we would fetch some data, and it just round trip after round trip after round trip. Once you're loaded, you're good. We even normalized data on the client, so things were super snappy, but you had these incredibly slow initial loads and initial renders. And so the next iteration on that was, how do we statically generate the queries that are going to be needed for a page and ship the data that's needed for the initial render with the page, so that we don't have to load the page and then fetch the data. So that's where the sort of like evolution of Relay, and this is the technology that powers Comet, the new Facebook.com. We rewrote Facebook.com from scratch. This is another story for another day. But it's the technology that powered that was Relay with these statically generated, ahead of time compiled queries that would be referenced by ID at build time. Like, we built up all of this static infrastructure. Without that, Relay would not have worked at all at Facebook. And without the equivalent that we had on our iOS app and our Android app, GraphQL would not have worked at all.
So when you say that, was it working and you were starting to adopt it and seeing problems, or did it never, like, what was the adoption like? I mean, was it?
Yeah, we built a version of Facebook using this technology, and the developer ergonomics were great. And the performance, the initial load performance, was not good. We had in parallel been building for our native environments. We had been building the sort of tooling to ahead of time compilation, compile the data that you would need for like whichever screen you're going to load, whatever view controller you're going to load. So we were already sort of innovating on both sides, on the web and on the native side. But yeah, we just determined that it was going to be prohibitively expensive to do any processing of queries and then render, yeah, like fetching the data for the specific view that was just rendered. So that's the like render then fetch.
Right.
It was just going to be prohibitively slow. We couldn't do that at all. And so we needed to do the like extract if this was going to be adopted. So in advance of the Facebook.com rewrite, we had kicked the tires on the technology stack that was going to power statically compiled relay. So it was basically a relay rewrite. We called it Relay Modern. And Relay Modern was based solely on everything, this premise that you cannot load the JavaScript, render the UI, and then fetch its data. You have to like render the tree
Right.
in order to figure out what the query is going to be and then ship off the query. So Relay Modern was all about, nope, we do it statically. We do it at build time. We generate the query for this page, or this component or this whatever, this partial. And then that was the basis of sort of Relay Modern. But again, like Relay outside of Facebook was hard because it assumed a bunch of things exist. You have to configure a lot. So
Right. Totally. I Sebastian has talked about server components being kind of like what's next for GraphQL, what comes after GraphQL. I think it was a document and talk maybe he gave. And it's basically exactly what you said, which is GraphQL has this idea that is so powerful. How does it get more concerns into our component boundary? And yet it requires some static, guardrails so that you don't shoot yourself in the foot, maybe with going back and forth. Some powerful tools that do the static analysis up front so that all you need is the URL to know what queries are going to be made. And just more like a traditional app, you can return the data sooner. You don't have to wait to render. Maybe there's dynamic scenarios where you have to wait to render, or there's like secondary rendering that can decide what to fetch based on what's there. But in any case, most of it you want statically done. But getting that set up is like even more involved than just getting GraphQL set up by itself, which is already going to be involved,
exactly.
especially when it comes out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just hard to set up, it's like it's different, right? In any other environment, you fetch data a certain way. And so I think the question became like, what's the successor to this that lets us just fetch data the way that people want to fetch data, which is like fetch, right? Like, oh, we have async await now. Like, I want to just do that. And that's where kind of RSC comes in, right? So if our components are loaded on the client and then need to go to the server to get their data, why don't we just load our components on the server, have them fetch their data, and then stream down to the client the response as soon as it's ready? And that's the basis for sort of RSC and all of the technology that came after that. So in many ways, and we could talk a little bit about BigPipe if you want, the precursor to all of this. In many ways, we've been building the same thing since 2008. We've been building the same technology stack for so long, based on everything that we learn and based on the sort of modern technologies of the time. But yeah, we've really been working on the same project for a very long time.
What is like the 1-2 sentence BigPipe? This is before all of this?
Before all of this, this is before XHP, which was the precursor to React, or a precursor to React. Okay, here's the scenario, and it's completely bespoke. It only worked on Facebook's infrastructure. You send down a static shell of the page, which has the layout of the page, and then you stream a bunch of script tags, and in each script tag, it says document.getElementById whatever .innerHTML equals whatever. And it would inject dynamic data as soon as it was ready from the server. It was Islands in 2008. And this was so transformative for the Facebook homepage. And this is the thing that sort of like made, it wasn't just streaming that was popular. It was an architecture that allowed you to stream sort of complete pages. You can't just stream HTML sequentially and expect anything to happen. You have to stream a fully, functional document and then inject into the page, and you'll render a loading spinner, and then you'll inject the real content. But we would also inject the CSS, the script tags, the everything you need in order to make that part of the page interactive. We called those things pagelets, creative. And this whole thing was awesome. And you had to write PHP, and your JavaScript was weird, and it was in separate files, and there were some weird constraints and some conventions. But performance-wise and UX-wise, it was awesome. And in many ways, we've been building that into a stack that can be used by the entire world since like 2008, 2009. And actually, there might be a talk somewhere on the internet of me talking about BigPipe and Primer and all of these weird abstractions that we had at Facebook that there was a lot of innovation happening, but it was being done inside of this silo of a proprietary technology stack. So when we open source React, another story for another day, when we open source React, we found a vehicle through which we could take all of this innovation and kind of use this as the wedge that we needed. So partial pre-rendering, which I think is the sort of North Star here, is the modern equivalent of BigPipe, but with modern tech, with React, and all of the abstractions that we know, for everyone. Anybody in the world can use it.
Awesome. Okay, so I'd love to hear about this because I don't know a ton about it. I mean, I'm a Next user. I haven't, but I stay away from like beta, alpha stuff these days. Again, gray hairs. I just let the kids play with it. But obviously, I've been following along with everything. Just vicariously watching on Twitter the talks and stuff. So I know it at a very high level. But I want to hear your thoughts about it. But just to clarify, so BigPipe, the spinners, the little pagelets, that was like fundamentally server side work happening. I mean, that was a big part of it, which is why this is can be considered a spiritual successor in the sense that a server component is doing work on the server. It's not this, we kind of went to this other place for a little bit where we did a lot of stuff on the client and now we're going back. But that's how BigPipe worked, right?
That's exactly right. And those pagelets were server rendered PHP classes. They were PHP functions. And I talk about the sort of swings in technology as people like to call it a pendulum swing. That implies that, sort of like a full rotation from one end to the other. I call it damped harmonic oscillation. We're sort of zeroing in on where we want to be. It was all server. Then it was kind of all client with a little bit of server. Then it was all server with a little bit of client. And right now, I think we're getting to the right balance between server and client. But what we were talking about, BigPipe pagelets, that was very much server delivered, 100%. Don't write any JavaScript. We can do this on the server, and let us take care of the small amount of JavaScript that's needed to wire all of this up. There was like a very small piece. But yeah, so anyway, now on to RSC and the successor, et cetera.
So, okay, so what comes after GraphQL? GraphQL is like there's a kernel of the idea there, but it's not quite the expression of the idea that's going to be. There's like something about the team realizes it's not going to be in everybody's React apps the way a hook is in everyone's React app, or you know what I mean? There's something that's too proprietary about it. And so, but the idea of co-locating the data there leads to like this kind of the last 5 years with Suspense thinking about what does data fetching look like in React? Is data fetching like a specific instance of a more general problem, like an async work that happens, like an animation? So is there like a deeper primitive there that because I know you guys have talked about that with Suspense, things like waiting on an animation.
Yeah, that was
And so anyways, we now have and I'll link to Andrew and Sebastian's talk at NextConf, because they talked about how it's kind of like the next, how it's basically the evolution of data fetching. Anyways, led us to server components. So now we have server components. Talk about PPR. Talk about like, if listeners of this show, we've had several episodes about server components. We all know, like, we love them. It's a very compelling idea. There's like even more cool talks coming out, recently about them. And I think we're going to be exploring them for a long time. talk about like given someone who understands how server components is kind of the culmination of what we just talked about. Um, what is PPR? How is it? Is it like a layer of abstraction above server components? Is it a separate technology? Just I would love to
Yeah,
just hear like what your thoughts about it.
that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, and I'll do the like ELI 5 version
I'd
because,
love that.
other people can go more technical. Um,
hmm
the best way to get a page to load fast is to just have it be perfectly static and cache it at the CDN as close to the user as possible and just load it instantly. And so if you have static content, if you have content that doesn't change, that's the same for everyone, best thing you can do is just serve it from the edge, super fast, static. Don't do any processing. No computers really, need to like spin up and like execute a bunch of code. You just serve static content. But static apps aren't particularly interesting these days. It's where we came from. It's amazing, but everything is personalized these days. Everything is dynamic. The most interesting interactions that we have are the ones that are with people about changing data and real-time information. And so they always have this dynamism. But dynamic apps historically have been like pretty slow. You have to actually go and fetch data from a database and hit the origin and then mash some things together and then deliver some bespoke content to that one page. So I think what we've been chasing for a very long time is we want the dynamic, personalized, real-time, page content. We want our apps to be real-time and live, but we want to deliver it as fast as static content is delivered. And there's many types of optimizations you can do here, but where PPR sort of plays into this is this idea that anything that is static on your page, we should deliver immediately. And anything that's dynamic, we should be able to stream as soon as it's ready from the server. Now, if you have something that's extremely simple and mostly static and has very little dynamism in it, you might not need it. But if you're building something that's personalized, real time, live updating, and you want it to render fast, so it loads very quickly and gives you that magical, it just loaded super quick, and has lots of, if you have something that is sort of sophisticated, you want it to be live, but you want it to load really quickly, this ends up being the best of both worlds. So the reason that I connect it back to BigPipe was because that's what worked so well for BigPipe was you get the static shell as quickly as possible. And the prelude to that, the sort of like initial render, would be a bunch of script tags that told the browser what work to go do and a bunch of CSS link tags. So the browser's chugging away and doing work. We're parallelizing the work that's happening on the server and the client. And PPR gives us that exact same behavior. So you send the static shell down, you tell the browser, start doing any downloads you need to of any script tags, of any styles, of any resources. And we're simultaneously overlapping the data fetching code that's happening on the server. And as soon as those sort of like partials of the page, those components, those server components are ready to go, they just dynamically stream in as soon as they're ready. And so it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. But the best part is you don't really have to change anything about how you write code. We introduced this abstraction. You alluded to this a second ago. I think you may have mentioned it. We introduced this abstraction called Suspense. All Suspense is it's a boundary in your code that allows something async to happen. So it's a sort of abstraction for the asynchronous loading of more code, of data, of images, of resources. You can use Suspense for it's suspensey images. But it's this boundary, and once you introduce this boundary into your app, you can do anything with it. Well, not anything. You can do lots of stuff with it. But it's really cool because now if I output a static shell, React already knows what to do when it gets to a boundary. It sort of yields, it goes and does what it needs to do. The rest of the shell can be flushed. So we get that best of both worlds. I think the fast initial render and the streaming dynamic content that can come in as soon as it's ready.
Very cool.
So yeah.
Great explanation. I have a few follow-up questions. So BigPipe, would you say the problem it was solving? Because if you think about it, back then you are writing PHP. This is all like server side to fill in these islands. What was the problem that led to wanting to show the spinners because presumably you could do it all in one pass, like a traditional server-side rendered app. So, um, yeah, what led to the actual like desiring having like part of was it to have part of the page rendered to show the user that something was happening? Was because all of these dynamic parts, as you were adding more dynamic features, some of them could take longer and they were slowing down the page and you didn't want to be blocked? What was the actual problem that kind of led to this pattern, the pagelets pattern from BigPipe?
Yeah, this is a great question. So it was always all about performance, and performance both absolute and perceived. And so the first problem that we had was some of our backends were computationally expensive and slow. And the sort of classic example is like newsfeed, fetching newsfeed it's very complicated. Like it's just there's a whole thing. And we optimize it and we optimize it and we made it faster and faster. But if a user was loading Facebook.com and they weren't even using newsfeed, they were just looking for their events bookmark so they could go figure out when that event was, or their birthdays, or seeing a message or notifications. They didn't. Why should we make them wait until we've generated a newsfeed for them before they can click a link to go somewhere else? So
And
we
the
wanted to
link is static.
decouple.
The link, it doesn't change. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's kind of part of it. But the other thing was, even in a world where all of the page is dynamic, the browser still had a bunch of work to do. The browser had to download static resources. It had to download script tags, link tags, preload images, etc. And what we were previously doing was like, you wouldn't start sending bytes to the client until you were done doing all of your data fetching. And then the browser would have to load a bunch of JavaScript. So what we just wanted to do was this. We just wanted to say, look, let the browser, the precursor to BigPipe, which we called Prelude, it didn't show anything on the screen. It was a white blank page, but the browser had the head tag of the document and started downloading a bunch of JavaScript and CSS. And so we would overlap. So those are the kind of like two things. And then the where streaming comes in, and it didn't start out as loading spinners. It started out as we had a hard rule that you could only ever load anything on the page in a top-down sort of left to right, or if you're an RTL, it would be right to left, but top-down fashion. So what that meant was like, I can't actually display the pagelet for newsfeed until I display the pagelet for the nav bar and the sidebar, because it depends on them being there.
Right.
So you wouldn't have spinners. You would just have a blank page that would have chunk, 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 chunk.
Right.
And we designed the CSS for this page to make it so that even if one of these components is completely missing, the page layout still worked and the content was still there. We didn't get to loading skeletons and spinners and all that stuff until many, many years later. This just looked like a top-down sequential load. And it's reminiscent of, I think Amazon.com probably still has this on their homepage today. So it's just a top-down loading. But the streaming aspect of it made perceived performance dramatically faster. So if we just show you a blank screen and then we load all the content 2 seconds later, people would say, okay, that's whatever. Even if we loaded only the nav bar and then 2 seconds later loaded the sidebar and then 2 seconds later loaded the homepage, the rest of the homepage, people would think that was faster, even though it was actually slower. But we could get the best of both worlds because the long pole of the request was usually one part of the page.
Right.
So we could get everything else out there as quickly as possible and make this perception of the page being loaded that it's loading really, really quickly. And we could get a fast TTI, time to interactive, like when the page is actually interactive, while still waiting on the backend. So it was always about performance, both actual and perceived.
And that was I'm sure that was all measured and people were staying longer and all that sort of, that was when you saw talk about that. That's
absolutely. Oh, we did such a crazy amount of, so we took the homepage of Facebook.com. This is like 2009 era. Me and my friend Makinde Adeagbo, and a bunch of others. We took the homepage, Adam Hupp, ton of folks. We took the homepage from 5 seconds TTI to 2.5 seconds by just implementing a bunch of these optimizations and deleting JavaScript code and rewriting things in a more server forward way. Less JavaScript on the client and more let the server do the heavy lifting. And when we made the homepage twice as fast, people engaged significantly more than 2 times more, right? You will stick around longer. And we didn't really measure time spent. We measure something called time well spent, which we could get into, but um, people would not click 2 times more pages. They would click 2.4 times more pages. So when you make something faster, it has a disproportionate effect on engagement. And so any optimization we could make to perf was always justified. It was like,
Yep.
removing, cleaning up, simplifying. And so that's, in many ways, I think we've been focused on performance for a very long time. And
Yep.
like, look, zealots will say like, oh, just make a simpler thing. Like you don't need to have all these bells and whistles. And I think, that's an argument. You can say that you should display fewer things and build simpler apps and do less stuff. But in general, what we were finding was users wanted more things, more features right in one place, and they wanted instant access to all of this stuff. And if we were able to find a technological solution to enabling that, let's do it.
Yep.
And so, yeah, this has always all been about performance.
Interesting. Very interesting. And that adds a lot of color to it. When whenever I pay attention to this stuff, because like I'm such in I've only have like the biggest company I've ever worked for is like 100 people, and then I've been working for myself for a while. So when we've done consulting with companies that are large, but when I think about myself as more of an indie maker creator dude, and I'm helping people who are in that same space, you're always worried about premature optimization, getting in the way these problems that are not going to be a problem for you early on when you're getting something off the ground. And yet, the first time I made like an SSG site, which probably would have been Gatsby, and then next, um, it's fascinating the effect it has on your behavior and your psychology. And when I pay attention to it these days, if I do click a new link from Twitter and the site's fast and I can just flick around, even if it's someone's personal blog and I just happen to notice that it's instant, I'm going to click way more pages. I just do that, even though
That's
I'm like
right.
the most anti premature optimization person ever. And it is still today. I mean, definitely today, most sites are not like this. Most big sites
Right.
do get more and more featureful and slower. So when you do
Yeah.
encounter a site that feels instant or near instant, and you can just click around and see the whole thing in a few clicks, it's lovely.
Right.
It's an awesome experience to have, and so I think that's the part of I like thinking about the UX side of it, because sometimes the performance conversation gets caught up in a strange angle, and we talk about the size of the JavaScript and all of this stuff when it's really we're talking about like is it a more delightful experience, even if you're not talking
Right.
about an at scale app, right? And even for a brand new greenfield app, again, SSG I think of as kind of the precursor of what we're talking about here, right? Because PPR is really like SSG plus the BigPipe stuff in a sense.
That's right.
And SSG, when I first came across it, we got like people kind of, I think, over indexed on it in the industry. And now we've come back to having the server do more work. But there was a fascinating idea, a kernel of an idea in SSG, which was I'm sitting here working on my app and I have a marketing homepage open and I see all this HTML and CSS classes, and why the heck do I have to like render this every time? I know that we can't like pre-render every
Exactly.
website because of like the halting problem. Like you have to render it to know what you're going to
Yeah.
render, so you can't know ahead of time. But I'm a human. I'm looking at the about page, the homepage. We consulted with folks doing Ember back in the day, and they had, Intercom is a huge Ember app. LinkedIn is a huge Ember app, but they want the homepage to just be like a HTML site. So companies that had big front end client apps would sometimes have a separate technology, something like what is the was it the Python one, the SSG generator from GitHub from the other Tom? uh what is it? It's I can't think of it right now.
I
That was
can't
the
think of it either. I'm
original.
sorry.
That's the
Yeah.
original SSG. But it's like, well, I'm just going to use that because when someone comes to LinkedIn.com or intercom.com, there's no personalization there, right? So
Exactly.
SSG comes out, we're making like our, Ember apps, our React apps, and you're looking and it's like you love the developer experience, the component model. But I have an about page, I have a marketing page, a features and benefits page. Why can't I just analyze this part and put it out? And in Rails, you would add something like a caching layer where you have like, you're caching the component. So it's a notion of a boundary actually. It's the same
Yeah.
as suspense, as you mentioned, because if the framework can know that this subtree is this dynamic or less dynamic or depends on this row in the database or doesn't depend on any database data at all, it just depends on code, then frameworks like Rails can generate it first time and then cache it, and then they can push that around the world and everything. So SSG was cool because it let the application developer. This is what I liked most about it. It let the application develop. It made it part of your application code, that you could basically think about this problem instead of having like a separate layer, like a varnish cache, or having a separate technology. Again, um, it's part of the concern if you squint hard enough. We have this component, it depends on data, but I want to tweak a knob and make a trade-off as the developer, that I want this page to be faster and less dynamic. Like I want to tolerate a little bit more staleness here, or this doesn't change at all and I want it to be maximally fast. Whereas this part, I want it to be, I don't care how fast it is because you're logging in, and the freshness of the data is more important than anything. And so this part, I want to value, the consistency of the data and not do any sort of caching. So that's the part of PPR I'm excited about.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think you're talking about the sort of evolution of Next.js itself. We want more knobs to be able to make more trade-offs between more static versus more dynamic, but we always want it to be fast. And there's growing sentiment I've seen lately that Next.js is getting more complicated, and I think it's kind of true in many ways, in service of making the sort of sophisticated, the most pathological, sophisticated cases possible in Next.js. We've almost lost sight of like the beginning early days of like what made it magical was it's just so simple, right? There was just very little to learn, and it kind of handled a bunch of stuff for you, not as infinitely configurable, not as infinitely scalable. Um, and so I think over time, what we're going to see is as more sort of like conventions emerge and sort of educational materials, and as we refine and fix the defaults, and we're going to sort of zero in on something that's going to be a really nice expression of I can start really, really quickly. I can get started super easily. Um, I can optimize like crazy, which is actually something that I really enjoy. Like it's just so supremely satisfying to like look at a graph and be like, this is when we made this piece static, and look at this drop, and then look at the engagement graph. Like you can optimize easily. And then you'll be able to scale infinitely, because when you do happen upon that sort of like that sharp corner, you're like, oh no, I need to do something. It'll be like, there's an answer to that. Now you can do this. Now you can do it this way. You can introduce this type of cache, and the framework will support all of those things. And what I'm excited about is, especially with things like PPR, I wanted to get to the place where like you don't really have to think about all of the sophistication that's behind any of this. You just kind of write the code that you need to write. I need to fetch some data, so I'm going to use fetch. I need to cache something, so I'm going to use cache. And then like it's just everything else is handled for you. You turn it on, your stuff gets faster. So yeah, there's a lot of really good innovation and research happening here. I've been pushing the team to actually share more about the research, because it's kind of like we're like in the arena trying stuff, and it's looking really promising. So yeah, we're having fun.
That's awesome. I know the team, like, with a project that has so much visibility, it can be hard to throw out your ideas. It's not 2015 or 2013 anymore. And so I'm sure that plays a factor in terms of just
Yeah, that's right.
sharing the failed experiments, the successful experiments. But I'm so excited for it. I mean, I again, like, just server components and server actions, which we didn't even talk about, but is even yet another part of the story of how can we bring more stuff in here that is that locality of behavior. Like, fetch is part of it, or even writing a GraphQL query is part of it, but the other side of the implementation is still not local. Server components, you make them, they're like local in terms of the lexical scope of the component. You could
Exactly.
change the fetch call, like the URL you put into fetch, and break a component, even though it has like co-located. But you can't do that with a server action. So I think that's just fascinating as another extension of this principle of like locality behavior, which I think it's so much fun. It makes React so much fun. And if you use other technology, it's like very hard to give up. It's like you realize it's gone and it's painful to work on. Um, but man, I think we could go for so much longer. I know we got to wrap up. Um, I guess just to get closing thoughts, like I'm curious. So I'm curious about, is PPR kind of a specific implementation of a general idea that's going to be explored in the larger React ecosystem? Is it a one-off extension of how a framework could use React server components, and it's really a next thing? Are other companies thinking about this kind of the best way to solve this problem of separating our static and dynamic content? Yeah, just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a specific implementation of a general technique that we'll see more and more of. I'm interested in seeing this also for like native applications, like what part of your native application can be, loaded from the client. It's already there. And then, you have pieces that this is how it already works. But I think, what happens if you want to load new pieces of UI versus just loading in data? But I think it's a specific implementation of like a general paradigm shift that we'll see. And it's always going to be in service of that, like, we want developers to fall into the pit of success here over time, right? Like you just write code the way that is intuitive and that is straightforward and is that standard that's documented, etc. And you get this behavior and these knobs and levers that you can tune. So yeah, it's like one of many kind of innovations, but I think it's one that I'm particularly excited about because of where I came from and the sort of history of I've been working on the web for since I didn't even have a beard, let alone didn't have grays in my beard, right? So, yeah, it's an exciting innovation here, and I think it'll be kind of worth it. Yeah, I'm excited for people to play with it when the time comes. We got a lot more research to do, but
Yeah, nice.
um,
I guess that was going to be my next question is like, um, what should, for folks who are excited about the work we've been talking about, the work you've been doing and what your team's been thinking about, is there anything coming up that they should look forward to? Is there somewhere they should go, to hear about the latest?
yeah, I'm gonna get the team, the Next.js team and the React team on this side over here to share a bit more about kind of what's going on and share the
Nice.
research more openly. There's no reason to keep it like close. I think like it's literally just a function of like how ideas are fragile, right? You share an
Yeah.
idea with the world, and it's like now I got to defend this, and and
Mm.
and and they should, but I want them to do that when they're ready. But yeah, I think follow along on Next.js. I think the next RC of Next 15 will be exciting. We had some a full start with kind of React 19 and the suspense change, and so that RC is going to become a different RC now once we have that landed and such. But yeah, follow along on what's going on with Next.js. There's a lot to be excited about for the future, right? If you're already using Next.js, whether you're using Pages Router or App Router, it's like there's a ton coming that you can be excited about in either world. Also, like I'm a React stan, so like if you're using Remix is also awesome, and the other sort of React-based frameworks as well. And I like that we all of the sort of framework authors sort of talk and kind of collaborate about a lot of this stuff. So yeah, follow along with the sort of Next.js team. I think the X platform, the everything app is
It's Twitter,
where
man. You
we
can call it Twitter. It's a safe space.
yeah, Twitter.
Elon
Great.
Musk called it Twitter. It's Twitter until he's
Let's
done. Yeah,
go.
that's it.
Let's go. Yeah, you can follow
That's just
along with
it's
the
done.
tweets and the whatnot.
Cool, man. What about you? If folks want to follow along with you, Twitter?
I think I need to start tweeting more
Yeah, I was
often.
gonna
Like I
say, I
just
know that I
I was on
follow
a
you, and I know, yeah,
hiatus.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe engage with me on there, and I'm better at replies. But yeah, I'll start sharing more as well. Follow
You have
along
a
on there.
newsletter? You have a
Um,
YouTube? You have a TikTok? No?
I have none of this. I'm just out here, just helping people wherever I can.
You're just out
So
here
um,
IRL like a lunatic.
maybe this will serve as the like forcing function
Let's
for me to
go,
like
dude. I'm
get
here
out
for
there
it.
and sort of start talking more. I appreciate the push. I'll evaluate and
All
I'll
right.
get out there more. Appreciate it,
Awesome,
man.
man. I think you got a lot of cool stuff to share. And like I said at the beginning, I'm going to link to a lot of your cool talks. Any listener of this show I think would benefit a lot, would enjoy the stuff we're going to put there. So, dude, Tom, oh man, such a good time meeting you. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. Thank you for everything you've done for React, for front end. Honestly, if folks don't know who you are, you have done so much to affect our day-to-day lives, make our lives fun, and just done a lot to shepherd React, bring a lot of amazing, talented people together, man. So appreciate you, brother.
I appreciate you. I hope we all never lose sight of the fun that is in all of this. Thank you so much for having me, man. Any other time you want to have a conversation, let's do it.
Awesome, man. All right. Well, I'll see you soon. Thanks everyone for listening, and
Talk
catch you
soon.
later. All right.
Peace.
Bye.